So, I'll say hello to everybody real quickly, because the fact of the matter is I actually want to get to some stories. These men can provide some history about Dallas radio, because they were all a significant part of it. In fact, I would dare say that the man to the far right, Bobby Patterson, is in fact one of the great living legends that this city has to offer. He's the only man up here whose music was played on Cliff and the Zoo.
And something else.
And he was on the Something Else show in 1966. Bobby Patterson is the only person up here who's also in the Warren Commission report.
And the FBI.
Because he was, and this is a true story, managed by Jack Ruby.
Right.
George Gimarc down there, as you all know.
You told me this was a costume party.
I'm surprised you only wore one zoo shirt. I'm surprised you didn't wear them all.
Okay.
The rock and roll
I'll
alternative.
change.
And the man without whom there would have been no KDGE. I'm sorry, the Edge. Eric Nadel, the voice of the Texas Rangers. And of course, the man who was the voice of the Dallas Blackhawks, which is what brought you to Dallas. Is that correct? That's what brought you here.
1976.
And in the middle, Mike Rhyner and John Rody.
Please don't worship us till we've earned it, okay?
You earned it a long, long time ago. Mike Rhyner is my leader. John Rody is my other leader. Actually, everybody up here on the stage is my leader. Guys, it's great to see you. Thank you for being here. Jeff Lyles, of course, the man who put this all together, so thank Jeff for being here. Jeff wanted to be up here because he knew people would be taking pictures of everybody and said, I'd like to be in that picture. Is that right?
He's bringing the youth to these pictures.
Actually, I just wanted to be the voice of someone who listened to the zoo. You know, when I was
Everybody
a teenager.
here listen to the zoo.
No, but I just wanted just for a second explain what it meant to me. Because when I was a teenager, you know, it was a culture thing. If you had a car, you had a Zoo Freak sticker in the window of your car, and that let the world know what kind of person you were. You know, and I can't tell you how many times I was sitting up at 2 o'clock in the morning listening to the zoo on my headphones, and the playlist went from Leonard Skinner to Kraftwerk to David Essex to, you know, just, I mean, Roxy Music, all this music that I never would have heard otherwise. And once Georgia's show happened, Georgia's show changed people's lives. I mean, it really turned people on to what became alternative music. He was the first guy in Dallas to play U2. I mean, you wouldn't have heard U2 if it wasn't for Georgia. And the Clash, you know, and the Sex Pistols. The Sex Pistols record, hear that on Georgia's show? Until I got that record, there were so many concepts I'd never heard of in the world. I didn't know what the word anarchy meant. I didn't know what bollocks meant.
You didn't know what a Sex Pistol was.
No. I didn't know what abortion was. There was a song on there about abortion. I was like, what's that? They didn't talk about that in the Richardson Independent School District.
Well, they certainly did in the Dallas Independent School District. So, I want to begin with something here. We were talking about this a moment ago when somebody came up to me and said, please talk about the environment in which these stations began. And the zoo especially, as we obviously have several representatives of the zoo here, and again, it's a tremendous thrill for me to just be able to say that. But certainly there was KNUS. There was KLIF, even on the AM dial, K-News on the FM dial, once Gordon McClendon got rid of Cliff. There was KFAD, there was KAFM. The zoo didn't necessarily begin out of nowhere. There had been sort of suggestions that Dallas was heading toward that road. And I want to talk to you, George, you're sort of the historian of this panel, in as much that you have collected all of these things and studied all of these things. So can you tell us a little bit about the evolution that led to getting Mike Rhyner and John Rody on the air?
Well, you know, radio really starts changing in 67, 68. That's the time the music starts changing. And it percolates into radio on a lot of different levels. We don't have college radio in Dallas like we should. Normally that would, in a major city, that would be where it would start. It would start in college radio and then work its way to commercial. We don't have that here. We have, KDNT went on the air in 69, but their signal didn't really get down here. SMU's radio station, TCU, they weren't players. So we were living in a very weird little bubble. KNews, once it was, they decided to do something with it, but we're just going to turn it over to a bunch of these guys with some wacky ideas. They started doing progressive radio, and the recordings that I have of them from 1969, 1970 are incredible. You've got newscasts where a guy's doing a 5-minute newscast over sitar music. And sound effects.
It was a swinging time back then.
And it's just weird. And they're playing really super deep cuts, like Help I'm a Rock from Frank Zappa. And
it didn't matter how long they were either.
No, and it's just kind of rambly stuff. KFAD was doing a lot of the same sort of stuff. Of course, John Dillon was over doing montage on KRLD, his little show, which was kind of a 1970 version of what I later would do. And then the opportunity came when Ira Lipson came down from Detroit with his buddies, and they launched the Zoo to kind of coalesce that into something a bit more commercial.
September of 1973, right?
There you go. And the first song was, anybody know what the first song they played on the Zoo was?
Hello.
What was that?
At the Zoo.
At the Zoo, obviously.
Simon Garfunkel.
And in fact, that's an interesting question. We should have asked these other people if they ever started a radio station, what is the first song you play? Because a lot of thought goes into that launch song.
Tell people what the first song you played on the Edge was.
That was "We Want the Airwaves" by the Ramones, and then we played Radio, and then we played "Do You Remember Rock and Roll Radio?" Those were the first 3 songs, all radio themed. So the Zoo launches and puts together an air staff of a lot of people that most people don't recall because they lasted those first 3 or 4 or 5 years when the station was kind of building its momentum. And then by 1976, 77, it really starts coming together and taking off and becoming the sort of movie that somebody like Kirby Warnock would make a movie about.
So Mike and John, talk about what brought you to the Zoo, because certainly, you have interesting stories that get you there, but talk about that a little bit.
Gee, do you want to do yours? I can do mine.
You got there first, go ahead.
Yeah, I did, and oddly enough, I came in under the name of Eddie Murphy. I think this is the wackiest thing of the whole night.
And he's been trying to take that name back ever since.
I know. And I've gotten word that since this program has begun, 103.7 has changed its format 2 times. That's good and bad, I guess. Bad for you, but maybe good for them. What brought me here? I was sent here. I was working for Mel Tillis in Amarillo at KDGE Radio. Back then, a huge footprint. Who was able to take a kid in on the witness protection program. And I did that, and then my brand of bullshit took me. I did the morning weather on Channel 4 in Amarillo, an NBC affiliate. So Willard Scott would say, "Here's what's going on in your neck of the woods," and then my rusty ass would show up. I can tell you on a watch how long that lasted in Amarillo, Texas. But they said, "Why don't you go on down there? That Bellows station has a rock thing that they're doing." And as it turned out, I'm not being a music fan or anything. I was more of a this kind of guy. And from WFAA-FM, KZEW inherited a large news and public affairs commitment. So it was 8 hours and 10 minutes a week of local news. So we would produce, and Rhyner helped also with these KZEW gazettes, where we would make fun of the news, or do this as the news, or take a lyric and this and over the news, and that seemed to make everybody pretty happy in keeping it to the culture. Then Ira had brought in earlier a guy named Jamie Fryer, who did the Urban Survival Handbook, which was an outreach ministry so hippies didn't have to pay their rent, which was very, very popular. That's a matter of fact. That is a matter of fact. Eric, you listened to the KZEW, didn't you? You remember that.
I did. In fact, when I got here in '76, I came here from Oklahoma City, where I had a job doing minor league hockey, and prior to that, 3 years in Muskegon, Michigan, which had no decent radio at all. But I was in college radio from 1968 to '72, and I grew up in New York City. And before I went off to college, WNEW FM in New York had become the first radio station that I ever really fell in love with. And they were playing pretty much whatever the DJs wanted to play, it seemed. And I came down here in '76, and I couldn't believe you guys were actually doing that.
Right.
You know, I had been in a radio wasteland for 4 years in Michigan and Oklahoma City. I came down here, and here's you guys doing that. And even your competing stations, their musical tastes weren't quite as eclectic, but Kevin McCarthy and Dick Hitt on K-News were fun to listen to in the morning. Ron Chapman and Bill Mercer and Susie Humphreys were doing a great show on KVIL, although, you know, far more commercial. And then Q102 comes in, and all of a sudden there's great options to listen to radio. And having been a radio junkie my whole life, growing up in New York, listening to Murray the K and Cousin Brucey and guys like that.
And everyone, that is when radio faded out under bridges. Some of you remember that.
And
they're slowly getting there, right?
And I'll tell you, one of the biggest thrills for me, my first couple of years here, Rhyner, you took a week off, and I filled in for you with LaBella and Rody. I was the sports guy for a week.
I remember
And
that.
that was the greatest thrill of my career.
I know nothing about this story. I would like it. What
I
was
had to
that?
beg for my job back.
So Mike, talk a little bit about, because you had grown up here, because you knew the radio, because you know and can talk eloquently, thoughtfully, and passionately about all the radio that you had grown up listening to. What did it mean to you to wind up on the KZEW, which was at that point the most powerful and potent station for, you know, folks of that generation?
Well, I was just looking to get into the business some way, somehow, any way I could. And I did this by showing up and letting them know and making them understand that I was willing to do anything for anybody at any hour, day or night. No matter what kind of shit work you have, load me down.
You're going to be doing call-out research for the next few.
Yeah, and that's how I made my way up there originally. And I was, you know, looking for somewhere else to go, or just some other, you know, vein to fit into. And they decided to pair John LaBella up with Johnny here.
Yeah.
And they decided they needed a producer. And somehow they looked at me, probably because I'd been around there for a long time. It was very apparent to everybody that I would not leave, mainly because of the pub tent I had set up in the lobby. And they said, "Oh, all right, come here, let's see what you got." And so that's how I made my way in there originally. Now the sports thing came around. 1 year, Cowboys were about to start up. By then they'd won a Super Bowl or two, and they were, you know, something like what they were about to turn into now. Kinda, you know, such as it was back then. And Johnny and John, they had no interest or knowledge of sports, but they realized they needed some sort of presence on their show. And so they knew that I was into it. They tossed me that little bone and I took and ran with it. And that was essentially how I started making my way up there.
John, did you like having Mike around?
Yes, generally I did.
Yeah.
I believe I overheard him describing me to someone once as, he's a little on the bumpy side, but rather likable.
Right. He certainly got there before I did every morning, and that was real important for me. He wrote some really funny stuff for me to say, and that was big.
Well, let's talk about
That's
that.
because I understood his delivery and his shtick.
Well, so I want to know how I've certainly seen every film clip, every existing YouTube clip that you guys have done for the last, I've seen them all and I've watched them for the last 10, 15 years. And I'm always still sort of, and Mike, you and I have never really talked about this, but I'm fascinated by what the relationship was like between the three of you, how characters were created, how voices were done. Because certainly the Morning Zoo, you created the format, it became a national phenomenon. It became adored locally, and it became repeated. Everybody did Walter from Waco when we got to school. Everybody talked about, we all tried to imitate Walter from Waco. And I want to talk about the evolution of the show and the evolution of the partnership and the friendship.
Well, you need to see, John and I, Labella, came from the same part of the country. We identified with a lot of big urban radio, and we had our timing down to that effect. We connected on that level that we knew about. Living in between New York and Boston was a huge radio opportunity for young skills, especially myself. So he came up here from KLOL in Houston. And we got together at that point. The Morning Zoo with Dave Lee Austin was going away, and they put him on the Morning Zoo. But remember that news commitment I told you about. We still had to have, what amounted to us or below corporate. You need to do news and public affairs and serve the public's interest, convenience, and necessity. And they were serious about it, too. Now, maybe it was a little harsher than that. Nevertheless, but we did a lot of news, weather, sports. The theatrics of the Morning Zoo were just that. It was planned chaos. The characters, Rhyner wrote this character called Hunt James, and that was voiced by Randy Davis.
It was voiced by the great Randy Davis.
Yeah, and it was very popular because of the response I heard when I said Hunt James. The place lit up, but it was one of those things.
And you couldn't get away with it today.
He really did, and I gotta say that I was 2 studios down from John. We were producing that day's zoo feature. We were plugging in obligatory sound bites and funny whack whack noises and stuff, and I was 2 doors down in Studio G, and he was in Studio H. There was no Studio I, and no one ever knew Mr. Peppermint was on the same floor. So you gotta remember, Below and the WFAA AM/FM TV complex was fucking amazing. They had all this beautiful equipment.
Let me speak to the manager.
Let me speak, and then
Yes.
Mike Shapiro
Mike
would come on and probably think about Tell You to Go to Hell. That was pretty much what that was about.
But yeah, I was down there at Communications Center. We were up on the 2nd floor, and they had all this space and fantastic gear and all these studios and shit. It was just, it was a big operation.
I think that was part of the edge of the zoo because we were using creative services from Channel 8 and the morning news and WFAA. So we believe we had a leg up because of Karen Cage. I don't know if you remember her.
Oh,
but
yes, I
she was
remember
the head
that
of
Karen
creative
Cage.
services, and not a sticker would go out of that building without her signing off on it. And for news and stuff like that, I would be called upon to go to Marty Haig, who's the vice president of news, and explain to him for 3 minutes why Paraquat was a hell of a story. But I said, look at me. Just look at me. Why do you think?
Now this Marty Haig was a badass too. I mean, he was over the entire news operation of Channel 8, which at that time was certainly the best in Texas.
Iola Johnson used.
Yes, Tracy Rowlett.
Toilet. Yeah, she would like the upstairs toilet. Iola
right.
Johnson.
She did.
I once parked in Troy Duncan's parking lot. That little shit almost had me arrested.
I think one of the reasons that you guys got saved so often was because the windows were so thick and triple paned, and the ventilation system was so good.
Yeah. It was very much like
Songs
the
were so
BBC.
long.
The doors were really heavy and stunk when they closed, and it was really a grand, wonderful time.
Bobby, I want to talk to you about the fact that you had grown up here.
Yes,
You were a teenage musician.
right.
You played in the 60s. You had hits in the 60s, hits in the 70s. You knew what these guys were up to. Eventually, you would go to work as a DJ yourself at KDGE.
Yes, I'm Dr. Patterson, pride and joy, and your baby boy. I grew up on the corner of Spring and Troy. I'm walking on the dirt, and the dirt ain't walking on me. I'm glad to be here. I call myself Walking Dead because I had the misfortune of dying in 2018. The doctors made a mistake on my surgery, and I couldn't walk or talk. I'm 77, on my way to heaven, ain't gonna stop by 7-Eleven. I am one of a kind that shocked the mind. I put your music in your behind.
I still don't believe you couldn't talk for a few years.
I couldn't. Jeff, excuse me if I get up and start singing in the middle of that. This is for me. I've sang so many times in this club, in this theater, that I feel like I belong here. Yeah.
You do belong here. There's no doubt about it, you belong here.
Yeah. Now, I got into radio. I did radio for 15 years at KDGE. And when I got on the radio, my objective, my purpose was to make people laugh. I like to have fun. And I like people to listen to me to have fun. I used to come on the radio every day and say, I'm walking on the dirt, and the dirt ain't walking on me. Remind people that it's a blessing to even be here. You know, God chose the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. I am the foolish thing. Don't worry about the size. Ain't gonna be no compromise. You just watch me rise. Say I'm qualified, justified, sanctified, and I will not be denied. Yeah, I used to tell jokes on the radio. People still call me and ask me about some of the jokes I used to tell on the radio. I had a cousin of mine called Cousin Quack. And Cousin Quack did 2 terms in the Army. He's about my size, and he got 2 Purple Hearts. And I used to tell jokes about Quack. Because one day we were walking down the avenue, and we saw a drugstore. So we went in the drugstore, and Quack say, I'm gonna give me some condoms. He said, how much are those condoms? And the lady said, it's $10 plus tax. He said, tax? I thought they stayed on by themselves.
I'd just like to see how much Eric Nadel really likes that joke.
So I like to have fun. Could have got a pull up game. You can look me on the cell phone, see me singing all over the world. London, what else? Lincoln Center and everywhere else. In Brooklyn, New York. And I'm proud of the legacy that I built in the world. And I just feel like this. If he can be 50 Cent, I can be a quarter and walk on water, just like an altar.
Bobby, I want to ask you about something very particular though. You were very much a part of local media, local radio, local television during the 60s and certainly going into the 70s. Your music was played on KLIF. You were on Abnac Records. You were on the Something Else show in 1966. Ron Chapman's TV show that was broadcast on Channel 8, which, shared the Belo Corporation with these guys. And then you were played on KZEW, and you've been played on KXT. So you've been played almost on, and certainly on KNON. You've been played on every radio station that's been represented here. I don't think the Rangers played you, but they certainly should have. They should amend that.
I'd like to thank
Never too late.
But I do want to ask you, what was it like for you to listen to these things as they changed? As local radio changed and went through AM, as it was the top 40, there were some soul stations. As Dallas radio changed, how much were you listening to it and how much did you pay attention to it?
Well, it changed quite a bit, and I was listening to, back in the days, KKDA was the thing in the black community, and Hammond Childs, when they called me and asked me to do radio, I thought it would be here for maybe a week or two. I ended up doing 15 years on that radio station. Thank you. Thank you.
I always liked that K104 was owned by a guy who drove me to Hebrew school every week.
Well, Chuck Smith was the manager, and we had a bunch of singers on at the time, Ariel Griffin, and Ernie Johnson, Johnny Taylor, which is my best friend. I'll tell you a story about Johnny.
What's really funny about that whole evolution of stations that I remember Soul 73, KDGE. They had that awesome afternoon show where you didn't know what was going to happen. And years later, things changed for Soul 73, and Hyman Childs was pioneering, one of the last minority owners of radio stations in this market. They pulled that station from his Jewish hands before he gave that up. He really did. He was fantastic and a great man to work for. He knew the community that he was broadcasting to. Soul 73, KKDA. Later, the station is now, and if you listen on the way home, it's Korean music.
That was a damn sad day, too.
No, I'll tell you what it is. It's still Soul 73. If you think about that.
Hey, you see, it's masterful bonmots like that put him where he is.
I don't know why you and Bobby don't have a show together.
When they told me they ever sent on the station to Koreans, I wouldn't try to learn the language. So I could keep broadcasting.
That's right, you were there at the very end of Soul 73.
Yeah, Hyman was a good friend of mine. And back in the day, when I first started playing on the radio, he would allow us to play our own music until somebody abused the privilege. And they played their records 7 to 8 times in a row.
So you could play your own, you could play Quiet Do Not Disturb, TCB or TYA.
When I first started,
You could play your records.
Yeah. And
I feel like that violates some FCC rule. George?
I used to listen to KKDA when we were setting up the Edge. I would listen to that on the way into work. And I would hear Johnny Taylor playing, I was telling Bobby about this, Johnny Taylor would have some woman on the phone and says, "Oh, Johnny, I wish you'd play, Effervescent Evening or something, or whatever. And he'd say, "Oh yeah, sure, honey, sure, honey." And he'd start the record, and he would start singing with himself, inserting the woman's name in the record, leaving her up, so she'd go, "Oh, Johnny," for the entire record. Brilliant. I felt at that time we could do anything at the Edge.
I remember when, me and Johnny Taylor was good friends, and one day I passed by the Longhorn Ballroom, and the police had Johnny up against a car like this, and he had about $200,000 or $300,000 worth of rings on his fingers, and it was just flashing in the sunlight and everything. And I passed by him, he looked around, he saw me, and I kept on going. So the next day I stopped at the office, he said, "Why did you stop? You saw the police had me jacked up?" I said, "Wonder you both of us are going to jail." So he was a character, man. There's not too many people in that era that I didn't know. So Bobby Bland, Little Milton, Denise Sal, and all the gospel, and I got pictures with me and Michael Jackson when he was 16 years old, and Billy Preston. I could go on and go on and on. Lou Rawls. I've met all these people and know them personally. So I'm blessed that I came along in that era.
But what was fascinating to me was that the Zoo was playing music that was being played on KDGE as well. But the Zoo was the only station on that side of the dial that was actually playing soul music, funk music.
We had Quincy Jones doing stuff like that. We had Prince doing Bambi. All played on the Zoo. Stevie Wonder. It was in rotation. It was definitely played, and they did a good job back then. Bob Shannon,
Sly,
Sly. They would do music that people enjoyed getting high to.
Were you allowed to play whatever you wanted? What'd you say? Could you play whatever you wanted?
No, I didn't play any music. I had no control of that. But those who did, this was, and George came along with the technological revolution when we had Selector, a computer program that would help make sure you didn't play George Harrison right next to a Beatles song. It was very high tech. Back then they had colored pencils in the back of the room. And so when you played this Bob Dylan song, and you're John Dylan, you mark the day of the month with a red circle. And you can't play that again until everyone has had a crack at it. Now the overnight guy, Charlie Jones, he had fakaka. He had nothing going on because the day would start all over again, see? And the morning show played the least songs and overnights played the most. And that was really when the disc jockey, as we remember them ever so romantically, exercised the art of the segue. When songs faded together.
But I think most of us have this thought that the Zoo was a place where it was free form, and it really was not for most of its existence.
No, most of its existence, especially the last 80% of it, it was controlled chaos. Everybody knew what we wanted it to sound like. And people would come in and go, "What? Is it?" Yeah.
I still remember the segues. I remember Roxy Music, Love Is the Drug, going into David Bowie's golden years. They did that all the time. They did David Essex Rock On into 10 cc's. I'm not in love.
Right. There were classic segues.
Lou Reed's Walking the Wild Side.
I'm really surprised George Gimarc didn't come up with a list of them and sell them somewhere. These are classic segues. I think there's money for these.
I'm astounded the morning show didn't market a line of corduroy pants.
No.
Because that was the one thing that the morning show never did influence its audience to get into, is corduroys like Lavella.
Well, he
His corduroys were very unique.
Yeah, he
I
had a
could hear
place.
him coming down the hall.
That snaps.
They saw some days.
He was brought up and did a lot of his growing up in Middletown, Connecticut. And those clothes followed him to Houston and back up to Dallas again, if you know what I mean. So there was a lot of patches on the elbows and those terrible Dickies that people used to wear.
At some point, he just started cutting off the sleeves of everything.
Yeah, and that was great, but I'd even forgotten where we started talking about that.
Well, I do want to ask George. So, George, you come in a little bit later, certainly with the rock and roll alternative. You've been doing college radio. Rock and roll alternative is the very opposite of what's being played on the zoo during the day.
I had honestly never listened to the Zoo before I was hired.
Right. You told me that once, and I was astounded by that. So, when you dropped into the zoo, which is playing the antithesis of what you're playing on Sunday nights, what was your relationship with these guys and any other and the other
Well,
folks at the station?
I was probably 7 to 8 years younger than majority of people that were in the building, so I was the green kid. And I was doing the phone bank research stuff. The call out research was the crap job that Chaz Mixon and Paul Trimble and I were assigned to do. And then I was given this cute little 90-minute slot on Sunday nights when nobody's going to listen. And that's when I also had to initially play stuff that would translate into the zoo listenership. So I had to play an occasional track from like off the first couple Rolling Stones albums, or Spirit, or something that was vaguely kind of psychedelic that might fit into my world. So I did that for a couple months as well.
That was like the Dr. Demento time slot.
Yeah, it was definitely. Yeah, I think Dr. Demento was in our Q102 across the dial from me. So yeah, that's kind of where I was, and then the show started gaining some ground, and the 90 minutes went to 2 hours, and eventually, before they showed us all the door and handed us our cardboard box, it was, I think, 3 hours on Sunday nights.
Which is extraordinary, because you were doing freeform radio in a way that I think we all imagined the zoo was during the day parts, and it really wasn't, because it certainly had consultants, and by the end you guys had certainly Q102 to contend with, and there were other comers that tried to take the zoo's crown as well, right?
The real game changer was the consultants.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And when was that?
That was Jeff
see.
Pollock was the.
Well, that was
Yeah,
during.
that
you remember WNEW New York? Well, we had Jeff Pollock, who was also their consultant. And if you were in Los Angeles, it would be amazing. They said, "This station sounds like the zoo." No, it sounds like Jeff Pollock, a consultant.
Do you recall the memo about 1981 telling us that the police are over? You really need to not play the police.
Yeah, well, that was sort of an era they went through, because there was a flock of seagulls. I think that's what we used to call George when he wasn't watching.
Oh, we used to call him a magic marker.
Oh, here comes flock of seagulls. Nice to see you. Ooh. But it was. We were all really much like a family, though, in a lot of ways. Everybody really looked out for the other day parts, because the competition was so fierce. So we were like maybe the Manson family, but we were a family. And, we would kill off our own. We knew how to send them out into the snow. And okay then, and that would happen, and that is the truth of radio back then. It was show business. I mean, I could have ended up on a cruise ship, for Christ's sake.
Hey, let me ask you guys something real quick. Did payola ever come into it?
You see, that's the thing. Record companies had huge budgets, and they would throw huge parties. They would put on great tours across America that were supporting new releases. So when the Police came out, remember those stupid whistles? Everybody in the industry had, "Stop, it's the Police." No, I'm serious. What the fuck is with these whistles? Well, it's the Police, you see? Okay then.
To your point, though, you will never convince me that pale was not going on back
Oh, it was
then.
going on.
It was just not going on at our level. We didn't
No.
see any of that
That's how
going
bad
on.
records got
It
on the
didn't
radio.
come down our way.
No.
It didn't happen up at the radio station. It happened on the level between record companies and the consultants.
Oh yeah.
Well-
And you know, John Dillon, he was the only one driving a Mercedes with a Datsun logo. There was a lot of stuff going on that was highly questionable. But Mike Rhyner and I, in news and sports, you know, we didn't see any of that. You got a lot of tickets to go to shows, because if you'll recall, back in the day, I think, what was his name, Gutenberg, with the morning news, had this column, and you'd review rock shows. That
Yeah.
were,
Yeah, I
who
did some
does
of that
that
stuff.
anymore? Well, I saw Rod Stewart last night. And you,
Yeah, sometimes one of those would fall my way and I would do it. So
Yeah, we were really good
rock
writers.
shows.
that's right.
What a bad life, man.
I was going to say that there was one time, and I really was sworn to secrecy in 1981 or whatever, that when I was the dog's body that filed the records, put them back onto the shelf, because that was as important as my job could possibly be. And my boss, who has been named this evening, was out of the office, and there was a record way up on the top, and I got a stool and I pulled it off, and all this dust just came down on me. I was covered in, oh my God, I thought it's been up there for 3 years, it's so dusty. Refiled it, and this person who has been mentioned before came in and was very irritated, closed his the door, and asked where his Coke was. Oh shit! So there was some level of something going on in the music director's office. But that only happened once. That I
And it never, ever happened again.
Yeah.
I worked very
Nothing like that was ever seen on the premises again.
That was all we know about it.
I do want to ask my workmates about something that I don't think I've ever discussed with them. Did you guys ever participate in the brief arms war that we had in the station with various disc jockeys bringing sidearms into the air studio?
You know, we had a lot of gun action.
Yeah, we did.
There was a lot of gun action, and I'll name names. Don't say I won't. But there was full auto, no problemo, was one of our DJ's cards. And when he did his afternoon show, there'd be a fucking machine gun sitting right next to him. This is in case it goes down.
Because there's
What the heck is that?
They do the same thing at Rangers broadcasts.
I don't know. They don't do that at Rangers games, I'll tell you that. But
We have no gunplay. No gunplay.
no.
Well, I don't know if we ever had any play, but boy, we were ready for it if it broke out.
So I do want to talk about.
The irony was we didn't have any 45s as records in the station.
Did you ask the question just to make that joke? I'm fairly sure you
I
did.
just do that. That's my job.
That reminds me of when James Brown used to have his radio station. He had three radio stations. One in Knoxville, Tennessee, one in Augusta, and then one somewhere else. But anyway, people used to come through there at night and shoot up in the station, you know. So I asked the jock, I said, why you got the gun there? He said, because they drive by here and shoot us.
Right.
So I said, well, it's been nice knowing you. I'll see you later.
You know, that's the thing, the way you interacted with the audience. You know, you talked on the last panel about hanging out outside Cliff and people hanging out outside radio stations, which you could do because they weren't on the 5th floor of some office building. We connected with our audience through letters. You know, we would have mail call every day. You know, we were on WBAP when I started doing the Rangers. It was heard all over the country. We were getting mail from every state in the union, and a lot of the mail was from pissed off truckers who wanted to hear Bill Mack. And we're doing a game from Seattle that runs past 11 o'clock when Bill Mack should be on. and they don't want to hear our meaningless baseball game. And we would get this hate mail from truckers all over the place. But how did you guys know what the audience wanted, or you didn't care?
I think you
What
know
kind
the
of
answer to
feedback
that,
were you
Eric.
getting?
Oh, we didn't get feedback. I'll tell you what. It wasn't feedback, it was pleas for mercy. It was pleas of desperation. It was my birthday. It's my wife, and she ran off, and I went to a Bowie concert. Could you play? And then they put in a request, and there was certain a group of the people I know at the zoo that would take requests, and it would ingratiate them with that one listener, and that is the magic of radio, friends. When you soon wrap up this panel, and I know you will, when you leave this building, you go away with the knowing of the music and the magic of radio, that there's somebody there who's heard, you, and they're broadcasting out. That's awesome, and they're hearing you say things, and they're usually by themselves. Think about it, the times that you've spent listening to radio where you remember, you didn't have somebody yapping in your ear, you were listening, and that is when connection is made with the radio listener. And so I couldn't have had a better employer for 15 years, and it's too bad because of deregulation of the broadcast spectrum. Single-owned companies can own 80%, 90% of all the stations in town, right here, right now, all of them.
And they do.
80% of them. That's crap. Do you think they care what station A makes if station B is making it? No, they cannibalize the audiences from the Eagle to KZPS. And then if you don't like that, here's Mix 102.9. Oh, you don't like that? Here's Eagle 97.1. Guess what? We don't care. It's the same company. And people don't know that. They're on the same floor of a building on Dallas Parkway. And you look, oh, there's Bo and Jim. Oh, there's where Russ Martin used to do, that whole thing. And I think that was probably the biggest death knell to the industry, was something that Ronald Reagan started historically, was the deregulation of the airwaves, allowing corporations to own more than 3 stations in a market.
Yep, that's where it all started going wrong.
And I tell you, we felt it right away because I used to love going sideways with my boss. How could I do that if my boss was going to be at the station I'd go to? For people like us, it was difficult because if they hate you at Clear Channel, you better go to Ann Arbor because nobody's going to want you here. That's absolutely true. So it has stifled a lot of the things. It is that corporate control, and everyone should know that. So if you think, oh, radio sucks, no, the law that governs these sorts of corporate machinations like they do.
Yeah, all radio's doing it is operate the way it was set up to do now.
Yeah.
That's it.
So competitors are not competitors. There's the guy right down the hall. How could you really compete with somebody like that?
Well, so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that. I wanted to talk to you about the wars that you guys would have, the pranks you guys would pull, and the shenanigans that were up to with Q102 and with the other competitors. George and I talked about this recently, and I wanted to ask you guys about this as well, because when Q102 came along and vied for the zoo's crown, it certainly wasn't something you guys took lying down.
No, and in many cases, truth be told, they won a lot of those races. That was actually the truth. Is we were perceived as the biggest station, therefore we were the biggest station. If somebody opened up an Arbitron and said, we're an elephant, come on, what do you do? And they'd forget all about it and go to that Dalworth CB and car stereo and get your ass a Dalworth CB and car stereo. Why? Because it's the zoo, Dalworth CB and car stereo. Because that was a hot commodity. Why? So you could listen to the zoo, Dalworth CB and car stereo.
You could get a CB.
Yes.
And of course,
it was so different back then, but really they had a different sensibility, and mathematically, they did win a lot of the ratings, and but it didn't matter because perceptions were to us. We had historically in broadcasting, and you'll remember all this when I mention it, January and February are very small months for radio income. What the money-grubbing geniuses at the zoo did is come up with what they call Zoo World. Come on out! It's a free festival for a weekend in the slowest advertising month of the year. So we want you to come out and check out all we have to offer you from Dalworth CP and Cars Stereo.
Yes, you know what today is ticket stock.
And later it became
Water
ticket
bags.
stock. Yes, it did.
You can live the commercial.
And, oh my God, it's just I get it. And so they can't really catch a moving object. So the competition between the stations was most evident in the world of concert sponsorships.
Right.
For some reason, it was very important for us to get the zoo's name on a ticket stub, because I know a lot of you people have the ticket stubs. Who does ticket stubs anymore? I mean, you'll get
Who
COVID if
even
you
looks
have-
at tickets anymore?
Anyway, so we would fight and jockey for position with Concerts West, Lou Messina and company, who put on the Texas World Music Festival, including and not limited to the Texas Jam. And those were huge opportunities. At the end of the day, there was no official station. We're covering it both like it was a Republican convention. I mean, good morning, the stage, it's wonderful. And then we had the Zoo Concert Echo. For those people who are...
Yes, the Zoo Concert Echo for people who were leaving the concert, who wanted to hear it again. We would get the playlist.
And we're gonna, because we had a guy stationed there, like a fucking spy.
Hello.
And then we would
would've
play
been me.
that just as everybody was leaving the show, because there was a Q van and a zoo van in front of Reunion Arena, and that was wonderful enough. But in the middle of the Zoo Concert Echo, we would play commercials for Dalworth CB and Cars.
Of course.
George's shows
Yeah,
are great
yeah,
too.
yeah.
The 98-cent shows. George did some rock and roll alternative shows that were less than $1 to get in.
I gotta say-
U2, the Cramps.
I gotta
Pretenders.
say there was one of the zoo things that I thought the station did that was really ballsy and brilliant. Was I think in '82 when the Who were on their last tour, and the zoo went to the concert promoter and said, "We're tired of fighting for sponsorship. We're going to buy every ticket to the show." Excuse me. We're going to buy. Do you remember this? We're going to buy every single ticket to the show. And then they said, okay, well, that's going to be $12 gajillion. Fine, so that's what we're going to pay. And then the station said, we're going to be giving away 20,000 tickets to see the Who. Listen for details. Then they went to all the advertisers, like, what was it, the CB and Stereo, something like that.
Yeah, there was one in particular that comes to mind.
And the deal was, if on a specific day, if you walked into their venue, their advertiser, you could get 2 tickets to this concert. Well, these advertisers were buying like a $10,000 flight of spots for their one day, and they would get like 100 tickets. Oh, wow. They ended up earning more money off those tickets, off the advertisers, than the face value of the tickets. And the competitor stations could not have any tickets to give away unless they went to one of our advertisers and got tickets 2 at a time, which they did. And I thought that was a brilliant move, but I've never heard of anybody doing that particular thing since. But
No,
it
it ended up being a bad idea. Because some establishments don't want somebody driving up in a busted up old gremlin, jumping out of the car with a black old Arkansas. Oh shit. Jim Dandy looking sumbitch. My Who tickets? That's when targeting became important. That's when focusing just a little on what we did, because I worked at stations. As a station when the zoo got rid of me, I ended up in Seattle at KISW, and we would always have the weirdest thing. In that market, they'd have a perp walk. People taken from the police station to the call. It was like in the morning, and you'd see it, and half the people were wearing our shirt. We were the Rock of Seattle, man. Like an A. So it's changed, Robert. It's changed a great deal.
It appears that it has, yes. I want to get to two things before we wrap this up, in as much as that there were two stations that really came out of the zoo, The Edge and The Ticket. And George, I want to talk to you, since it's chronologically that way. Let's talk a little bit about the birth of The Edge in terms of what The Edge did and what The Ticket also did later. It wasn't necessarily about the formats in terms of why I love them, although certainly I was in 1989 listening to what The Edge was offering. But it seemed that The Edge learned, as The Ticket did, that what the zoo did best wasn't necessarily what it played or who even played it, but that it created this community that we talked about in the first panel. I mean, Zoo World, I remember going to a Zoo World as a kid with my dad. My dad wanted to know what that funny smelling cigarette was. The Edge certainly did create that with the concerts, with the Edge Fests, with the albums, with the DJs, and certainly The Ticket has become, for me personally and for me as a listener, very much a family as well. So talk to me a little bit about the genesis of The Edge and what you had learned from lessons, that you had taken from lessons learned at the zoo to begin that.
Well, The Edge wasn't my idea. It was an opportunity. There was a frequency available in owners that had just bought this and they didn't know what to do with it. And I suggested, hey, why not do a 24-hour version of what I used to do 3 hours once a week over here. And because I walked in with a master tape by XTC that I had recorded 3 weeks earlier with the band in the studio in Dallas, they went, he's connected. So I got the job. It was simple. And they didn't know anybody else in town, makes it even easier. We designed the station to be a commercial alternative, so we would play stuff that nobody else was playing in town, and I guided those choices along with, ably assisted by Wendy Naylor, who was coming from Phoenix. And between the two of us, we helped hire the air staff, who we trained to be personable, talk to one person at a time, not you all. Never say that, hey, we here are playing for all of you guys. It was always one-to-one radio, which is a pretty magical thing, which is something I learned at the zoo. And our intent was to put, in fact, it was a rule, if you put anybody on the air, they have to be at least in college or sound like it. No high schoolers on air on the phone, because we didn't want that super youthful experience. We wanted to be the college station. And then we kept everything in, we had different boxes of different styles, and they were all jumbled up to where the station didn't get into a groove where they were playing the same sort of record again and again. It would be, you would play something that was kind of a Euro dance thing, and then the next thing would be kind of a roots rock, or an Americana sort of, well, not in that sense, but like an REM or a 10,000 Maniacs sort of thing, and then something that was exceedingly silly like the B-52s, and then maybe something local, and then maybe something that was really a guitar record like the Cult. And you kept that mix in that jelly beans, because people would really they would say, God, I love that Erasure record, but you gotta quit playing the Cults, they are dreadful. And say, okay, yeah, we'll put that into consideration. The next call will say, man, you gotta play more Pet Shop Boys. So we would be touching all the corners and trying to please everybody most of the time. And it worked. And for the longest time, we owned about 90% of the records we played on the station. We owned. Nobody else was playing them. And some of them got really embarrassing for a while. I mean, we were playing Pearl Jam, and the Q should have been playing Pearl Jam at the same time we were in, and they weren't, because we stepped out on it so early. They felt we owned it. It was our record, and they're not going to be caught playing one of those Edge records. Oh my God, you should have been playing Pearl Jam. So it was an interesting mix, but that was kind of the basic design of the station. That all changed in about year 5 with the new direction and new owners, and then they decided to become a station that was followers rather than leaders, and also tell the air staff to shut up.
So Mike, let's talk about what you learned from the zoo when you began the ticket.
Well, most of the guys at the ticket, when we started out, were a good bit younger than me, and there were a few of them who had listened some to the zoo, but most had not. So what I thought was important to impart to them was just sort of the mentality that we had up there at the zoo. We kept things loose up there at the zoo. There was not a lot of real uptightness going on up there. Off the air, there was always a good bit of fun. And I tried to, impart that idea to all of them, to bring it onto the air and keep it going off the air as well. And I think that translated pretty well. I think they all caught on to that. I think they took it to heart, and it came across on the air, I think. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. Well,
I mean, Spence Kendrick was here earlier tonight. I don't know if... Oh, okay, there he is, right down front. Am I right about that?
Well, the reason I asked that, and I think it's a good way for us to begin to wrap things up, is that we talk about, and George, one of your questions that you sent me the other day was, can it happen again? I assume that's kind of what you meant. Can terrestrial radio be today what it was in 1968, what it was in 1972, 1985, and 1989? And I keep getting the sense over and over again that it still is, for many of us, that thing that we always imagined it was or wanted it to be. I can find any number of radio stations today that I still really love to listen to. Certainly The Ticket, certainly KNON, and there are a handful, The Range, KXT, and there are a number of stations that still create a community and still feel like they're speaking directly to me. So John, I'd like to begin by wrapping up. Do you still think that radio, even though you've been through the consultants, even though you've been through the shutdowns, you began a pirate radio station of your own because you believe in the power and potency of radio, no matter the level on which it takes place?
No.
I assume that you still think that it has the power and potential to be what it always was.
Well, my wife Sally and I got the opportunity to own a legal radio station. And we thought that was, can you imagine this to me in my little pea brain, coming out of retirement, doing nothing? I said, why don't I build this station with the technical background that I had? We did get the pirate on the air, and we had KFTW as the call letters. We were, in terms of audience reach, one of America's largest LPFMs, because we had promotion that was incredible. It was very zoo-ish. It was, the pirate did what it wanted to do. The pirate was over there. The pirate says, the pirate wants you to, or reminds you that, and so that was part of that magic and stuff. What ended up happening after 5 years, I never did find anyone to take over the radio station. My health was failing, and COVID set in. All of our sponsors were bars and taverns in Fort Worth, because all we did is play Fort Worth local music. We only played Fort Worth local music. Maybe year 5 or 6, I started thinking if that may be not such a good idea, but we had somebody coming in every Thanksgiving to do Alice's Restaurant, a Fort Worth version. We would put Betsy Price on the air whenever she decided that was worthy of our time. And what we did learn, it was very difficult to get people excited about radio. We have a friend, Michael, here, who had the same problem at KTCU, where we just had trouble getting getting the P1s like we used to get the P1s. We get the P1s, you can do anything. Parallel 1 listeners are those who will shove anything in their ears to hear your radio station. They are your effective fan base, the P1. And so I would say, I don't think stations, there are going to be novelty attractions. The ticket will eventually always be, just imagine what the zoo would sound like today if it were on. Would we have someone on who never told you their last name? Hey, I'm Sean. I'll be here till 3 o'clock. The things that we look to radio, right? The things that we look to radio for back then, we're set. We're driving around with satellites in our cars. We have the Spotify. We have the Siri. Siri, play Mahavishnu. I mean, play something weird. Hocus Pocus. Play that. I can hear it in 1 second by doing it on my phone. And by virtue of that empowerment, the listener wins, but they lose what was between the records. Yeah. See? Am I shedding a tear? You're goddamn right. Because nobody can do that on Spotify. And Clear Channel can keep beating into the bush, but eventually people are going to catch on that they're the evil empire. They need to be shut down. But it will never happen. So we go to other lengths, and we started a 501c3, we ran it, we were a public radio station, very much like KNON, except not so much Latin. No, it's good, the Latins. But anyway, but it's what's between the records, right? So I would hope people savor that. Do you agree, Mike?
I do.
Thank you.
I mean, I've always been quite bullish on radio. It's always been a magical thing. When I was a kid, all my friends were watching My Mother the Car or The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis or whatever. And I was in my room listening to my transistor radio, digging on Russ Knight, the Weird Beard on the Mighty 1190 KLIF, you know? That's what I was into. And it's always been this really magical thing to me. And what's happening to it right now just kills me. Because it really did matter. It's always mattered to me. It may always matter to me. I don't know. But the fact that I don't know does not bode well for it. There are just too many options out there. People have too much going on. There are too many options. It just ain't what it used to be. And it doesn't seem terribly interested in doing the things that it might ought to do to make itself that way again.
And the other thing we haven't even mentioned is satellite radio.
Yeah.
When you look at what you can get on Sirius XM, where you actually do on some of those stations have connections with the disc jockeys.
But you
It's
don't
not
have the same.
local.
Yeah, that's the difference. You don't have. You're not going to bump into that guy in the grocery store. He's not going to be introducing a concert the next weekend.
Right.
That's the difference, right?
But I mean, we are really lucky here. I mean, for me, Brett Dillon, he's the Tom Petty guy. He's the last DJ. He's playing when he wants to play. Even at KXT, I think they're a little more limited than he
They
is.
can just play Wilco.
And I am really grateful for KXT and what they've been able to do, and especially what Amy's been able to do with the local music. And now it's not just that 1 hour local show. You're hearing local music all day on KXT, and it's fabulous. I mean, every single day I'm grabbing my phone and I'm taking a screenshot, I'm taking a picture of what's on KXT so I can, when I'm done driving, I can listen to what that band is featuring. That gives me some hope, but John made the point earlier, if the stations are, 90% of the stations are owned by these big corporations, the future's not bright except for a couple of outliers in each market. And we're lucky, we still have KNON doing what they do, and we've got KHYI doing what they do, we have KXT. That's probably more than most markets have.
George? you certainly haven't given up your faith in radio. You are constantly trying to start something new and different and unique in radio.
Well, in music radio?
Yeah.
I lost my ass in my last music radio adventure because it didn't go anywhere, even though I did get the first patents ever granted to anybody.
Was
in the
that
radio
short
format.
attention span
Short attention span radio.
Radio SAS?
Radio SAS, short attention span
I'm not
radio.
going to elongate the show tonight, but I must tell you, just what would Radio SAS is what would happen if you took out the middle eight out of every song on
And
the
got rid of
popular-
the third verse.
and got rid of the third verse. The record would lose 33% in length, hence you hear more music.
20 songs an hour.
And Wired Magazine is the only one on our
nobody
panel.
noticed that they were short.
No, they didn't notice, but people who knew didn't like it, George.
They weren't the audience. Top 40 was the audience.
Well,
And those
They
people
didn't-
don't take
they
music
didn't like
seriously.
it, George.
It wasn't for classic rock, it was for top 40. And I've used that protocol.
Wired Magazine, can you believe this? And everybody with a woolen cap said, "Whoa."
And I've used that with stand-up comedy, that very protocol, and I've got a successful network that I own in its 12th year in the US and Canada. A network that was originally, in year 4, was purchased by iHeart. And then I replicated it and built it again, and I'm still running it by myself. And that's using my protocol. Now that is radio that nobody can get by calling it up. Nobody can get safe for work comedy by saying, I want to hear John Panette talking about such and such, because they don't know the name of the comedian, they don't know the name of the bit. They have to wait until it comes up. And when people, that's how we became the #1 channel on iHeart for years, which prompted them to buy my company. Comedy works. Comedy is entertaining. Comedy is what DJs used to be between records, except I do that now without the music.
I'm going to wrap it up with Bobby Patterson. Bobby, you were the legend. You have not been on a radio station in a few years when Soul 73 became Soul 73.
Yeah. Well, everybody else is ripping and tipping and tapping and making them sexy sounds. In the meantime, in between time, I'm down here on the ground.
Thank you, Bobby. Thank you, everybody on this panel. Gentlemen, this has been one of the highlights of my career. I can't thank you enough for being here. Thank you all. Please. Many hands for Robert.